All right, now that we know what state is in ASP.NET Core MVC, let's go ahead and figure out how we're going to work with that in Visual Studio here. So I already have done some preliminary work here. The first thing I did was I added newtonsoft.json. So this is the ending point, or where we ended at with the Chapter 8 NFL Teams application that we had. And what I would like to do is add in the functionality to have a favorite team. So we'll add a button to the view that essentially allows us to favorite one of the teams in the application. And then once we click that button, then we'll have a web page we can go to see all of our favorite teams. So the first thing I did was I added a reference to newtonsoft.json. So newtonsoft.json is a ASP.NET Core library. I believe it used to be a standalone NuGet package, and it might actually still be. But Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC also has a wrapper for that, newtonsoft.json, which we'll use here in our application. So if you have any questions about how to install it, it's in the PowerPoint. There's also multiple ways you can install it. The first one is if you're using Visual Studio 2019, whether it be Community Edition or Enterprise Edition, whatever the case is, you can go to your NuGet package manager, and then you can search then Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC newtonsoft.json, and then you'll probably need to pick the most recent version, or the version that corresponds with the ASP.NET Core MVC that you're currently using. So hopefully 3.1.0, which is the most recent version. And then once you select that version, you can select install, and I would recommend installing it in your base MVC project. If you have more than one project, you can install it there if you need to. But you'll definitely need it in your MVC main project here. So for example, my NFL Teams project. So another way you can install, if you're using VS Code, you can come to your terminal down at the bottom here, which is what I did, and I typed in .NET, so I used the .NET CLI or command line interface. So .NET add, and what I'm going to do is I want to pick first the project that I want to add it to. So I want to add it, like I already mentioned, to my base MVC project, my NFL Teams.cs proj. And what do I want to add to that? I want to add a package. And what package do I want to add to that CS project file? I want to add the Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC newtonsoft.json. And then after I type that in and hit enter, since I didn't specify a version or a -v parameter or a -- version parameter, it'll go ahead and get the latest version, since I didn't explicitly tell it which version I wanted. So it goes through, gets the information, does a GET request on the API, NuGet API for Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC JSON. You can see it gets 3.1, which is the version of ASP.NET Core we're using, 3.1, and then it installs that into my CS project file, or whichever file you're using. So if you actually go and view your CS project file, you should see a package reference to now Microsoft ASP.NET Core JSON, newtonsoft JSON. Which version? 3.1, which matches our version of our .NET Core. It looks like they're on 3.1 minor version 9, so it looks like they've had a few minor versions come out since ASP.NET Core 3.1 has come out. So what we'll use this for is saving our Teams object in sessions. So our session, if you have read the PowerPoint already, so going back to the PowerPoint presentation, if you go to the methods we can call on our session, let's see, where are they? So you can call setInt, setString, getInt, getString, or remove. So this is how we can work with our iSession interface. But since we're working with a collection of teams, we don't have an integer or a string. We have a bit of JSON that we want to save. So what we're going to do is actually convert that JSON using the Newtonsoft library to a string, and set that string object here using this method. And then we'll get that string value using a key later, and then it'll return that JSON object. That way we can use that JSON to print it to the page. Okay, so now that we have newtonsoft.json installed, hopefully, let's go ahead and start building out how we're going to use our session object. So let's go to our home controller. So our home controller is where we'll need to save it to our session. We don't need a migrations. We'll eventually need to put something in our view. I believe our details. So the first thing we'll want to do here is add a button to our detail view. So remember, this view is the detail for each team. So we have a return to home page button whenever we're reviewing a team's details. And what we want is a button that says, I want to add this team to my favorites. So let's put the button right beside this return to home page button. And what I'm going to do, since I want to post back some information to the controller, I'm going to go ahead and start a new form object on my page here. Let's go ahead and tell it which action I want it to use. I'm going to say add. So I want to add a team to my favorites. The method type will be post. Since I'm posting information back to the server, then I'm probably going to need to move this form tag to the end of my line item here. Okay. Let's indent this in so it's formatted a little nicer. Then from there, let's add a button after it. Go ahead and give it a type of submit. Let's make the button look like the other button, and I could just copy, which doesn't look like I have it. Let's say class equals btn. So the button class from the Bootstrap CSS, let's call it btn primary. Okay. So there's my button. And let's say add to favorites. Let's give this same class to this other one as well. So that way the buttons look the same. So index. Let's maybe put this on a new line then. Okay. And we also need to post the team's ID that we want to add to our favorites, which will then model bind, which we'll cover next week, to our team's model. So it looks, as you can see, we're using this team view model. So we want to attach the team that we want to add to our favorites to our team view model, so we can put that in a hidden field. Type equals hidden. I don't see hidden here, so let's just type in hidden. And what do we want it to be for? What part of our model do we want to put this hidden field on? Well, we want it to be for the team.team ID. We want to bind it to. Okay. So that should add our add to favorites button to our view. So we'll need to go back to our home controller and do some work there to add that to our view. So here's our details. So we're already passing back all of the details. Let's go ahead and let's minimize some of this stuff we're not using. We'll end up doing some stuff with the index to add in our session. So let's leave that for now. That's one thing I don't like about Visual Studio Code. I don't know why when you do that it doesn't, and you hit enter after the line, why it doesn't just add it in after the method. But anyways, I digress. Okay, so let's remember this is going to be an HTTP post method. Helps if I put brackets around it, HTTP post. So we're going to add a post attribute to our method. It's going to be public since we're calling it from the view. And what we're going to do is when we click the button, we're going to redirect back to the index page. So we're going to click the button, redirect back to index, and tell the user that their team has been added to the favorites. So let's return a type of result of redirect. Redirect to action. Result, call it add, since that's what we told it it's going to be on the view. It's going to take in a team view model because that's what we bound our data to. Okay. So since we have the team's ID, let's go ahead and get all of the team's ID information from our database. So let's say our data.team. All right, so here's our team object. That's going to be our favorite team that they're passing back to us. Let's go ahead and find that team in the database. So it's going to be context.teams. And then let's go ahead and say .include because we want to get all of that information from the conference and division. So let's say t.conference.include the division. And we want to filter out only where the team ID matches the team ID in the database. So let's say where the team ID equals the team ID that was passed back to us. And then since it can be multiple teams, we're going to go ahead and do a first or default on it. So if you found it, return the first one. If you didn't, return back null. So this could return multiple items. This just returns one of those items. Since it's an ID, it should be unique, and it should always be the team that we want. Okay. So now we're going to have to do some work to get it in our session. Now we can work with the session much like the PowerPoint shows us we can do straight from the controller, but it's usually better to wrap all of the things you can do within a session inside a wrapper class. That way you can call all of those methods generically from a different session. So I'm going to go ahead and make a session specifically for this NFL application that's going to manage how we manage our session essentially. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our models. This is throwing an error right now because I need to redirect. I'm not currently doing a redirect action. So to get rid of this error, before we do that, let me just go ahead and do a good programming technique and make sure this builds before I go on to my next action here. So return redirect to action. And I'm just going to go ahead and redirect. We're going to end up redirecting to our index action here. And then we're also, just like we always do, we're going to pass back in a new complex object our active conference and our active division. That way we can display it on our index action. So let's go ahead and say the active conference equals, let's just go ahead and put an empty string right now because we're going to end up getting that from our session. And our active division, again, we'll just leave as an empty string right now because we're going to get that from our session again. Okay, so now this builds. So let's go ahead and go back to our models. And inside of our models, I want to do a new file. Let's say NFL session.cs. Okay, so if you're using Visual Studio, you can simply right-click New Class, and it should put it within your file for you, or your folder. Let's go ahead and give it a namespace. If I can hit the right button here. And my namespace will be NFL teams.models again, since I am within the models folder. And my class name will be public class NFL sessions, since that's the name of my file. Okay, and this will control the session then for my application. So since I want to get a few things uh, from my session, I want to get my favorite teams. I want to get how many favorite teams I have, and I want to get the conference and the division uh, from there. That way I always know which conference and division to set on the left-hand side navigation. So I'm going to go ahead and make some keys for that. That way I can use that key to get that particular value from the session. So I'm going to go ahead and do private constant string teams key. So I'm going to be able to get the teams equals my teams. So that's the key I'm going to use to get the teams. And let's just do that for my other three as well. So let's get the count equals teams count. Let's get the conference and the division. So conference key and one more for the division, div key. Okay, so now we have keys to get all of our information from our session. What we need now is the session. So let's go ahead and use the iSession object, call it session. And we want to create a couple getters and setters for that. So let's say get set. And we'll also need to include the using statement for the session. So if I control period, you can see that using Microsoft ASP.NET Core HTTP, which is the correct using statement, and that gets rid of that red line now. Next, what I want to do is set that session. So whenever somebody calls this class, I want to set the session that I'm using. So I want to go ahead and create a constructor, generate a constructor, which uses that NFL session, and I want to put that below my getter and setter actually. Okay, you can see it gets past this iSessions object, which then saves my session. Then I want a few methods that's going to get and set my teams. The active conference, the active division, get my favorite teams, get the count of how many teams I have. So I'm going to be coding a few methods here to get and set all of this information. So let's go ahead and work with the teams first, since that's the first key we have. So let's create a public method that we're going to set the teams. It's not going to return anything. Let's call set my teams. And it's going to return back it's going to take in a list of teams. So let's go ahead and say list. It doesn't like it because I don't have my list collection here. So let's go ahead and add it. So using my collections generic namespace, it's going to take in a list of team, which it still might need that as well. Actually, it's within the same namespace, so that should be fine. So it's going to receive my teams to set in my session. So let's go ahead and say session.setObject. Actually, no, we still need to add in our names. We're going to need to add in a way to set our JSON using our Newtonsoft. So remember, we added in our Newtonsoft library, and we actually need to have a couple helper methods to set our string object, which is going to be our JSON. So the first thing we need to do is convert that JSON to a string, and then we can set that string here in our object. So before we get to this, let me go ahead and comment this out. And in the next video, we'll talk about how we're going to build helper methods for our iSession object to extend its functionality to include JSON as well. So I'll see you in the next video.